Welcome to Local Chats. I'm Lewis Adams, and my guest today is Michael Robotham. Hello.
Hi, how are you?
Would you like to just talk about yourself?
I'm a former journalist and ghostwriter, and I'm now a novelist who's just published my 10th novel. Grew up in small country towns in Australia and spent much of my journalistic career working overseas, but now live in Sydney.
And we're having this discussion at the Bendigo Writers Festival. How have you been enjoying it so far?
It's great. I mean, I think I love regional festivals, and I love what happens in major cities. You know, readers become sort of a bit blasé about the fact that big writers come through and that every year they'll get to see someone. Whereas when writers go into regional areas, there's a great appreciation from the local community that you've made the effort and you've come, and therefore they come out and see you, and the crowds tend to be tremendous. And no, it's been incredibly well organised and very welcoming.
You have some very interesting stories about your inspirations for some of your novels. I know Shatter's got a very interesting story.
All of the stories have been seeded in real-life events. I mean, even The Suspect, my very first novel, that came about, I was many years ago talking to a social worker in Nottingham who had just had to go into a hospital and take a newborn baby, a teenage mother who had been deemed by the courts to be incapable of looking after this child. She had, she was just too young. And so this teenage girl was screaming as this baby was taken out of her arms, because you can see she was so in love with this child. And the social worker looked at this tiny boy as she carried him away and said to herself, one day you're going to come looking for me, and are you going to thank me for having saved your life or blame me for having ruined it? And that was the sort of seed for The Suspect, I thought. What if someone, because we make these decisions, social workers and judges and whatever, with the best possible intentions. But what if they get it wrong?
That's such a terrifying real-life situation.
They've all got their seeds. Most authors will tell you that a book begins with a what-if moment. And, even my latest novel, Life or Death, it actually has its seed 19 years ago when I read a single paragraph in a newspaper about a man who'd served a long prison sentence who escaped the day before he was due to be released. And I remember thinking to someone, why? For what possible reason would you do that? And it took me about 10 years to come up with a reason. And in the real life story, this prisoner called Tony Lanigan has never been seen since. It was a mystery, which even though my book isn't trying to solve that mystery, that was the seed of the story.
That's so fascinating. The fact that in the real life story that no one knows why he did it.
Yeah, it's funny because his name was Tony Lanigan. He was a 2-time convicted killer who had spent nearly 30 years in prison, but had turned himself into a model prisoner, and he escaped from Long Bay Jail just days before he was due for parole. It's really interesting because 2 years earlier he'd escaped again just before he was due to be paroled.
Oh, really?
And he spent a night in the Blue Mountains and then waved down a police car the next day and gave himself up. So when he escaped the second time, nobody put a missing persons report out because they assumed that, Tony will be back tomorrow. He'll knock on the door and he'll come back in. He has never been seen since. And that's 19 years. He's probably Australia's least most wanted man because he was a model prisoner. But it's still a mystery. It's still a mystery as to how you could vanish so completely when you'd been in prison for most of your life.
It almost feels like he was a few steps ahead from the system.
Yeah, it's funny because some people think he's a mound of earth in the Blue Mountains somewhere, and other people think that, he was a former merchant seaman, that he managed to jump a ship and is living somewhere in the islands quite happily, so it's a mystery.
You mentioned you've done some ghostwriting, and you've collaborated on a few autobiographies.
Oh, it's always a fascinating process. I did 15 autobiographies for all sorts of people. I can only mention about half of them because you're sworn to secrecy with a lot of them, but they range from sort of politicians to pop stars to soldiers and adventurers, and people like Lulu, the 60s pop star, To Sir With Love.
Yep.
Jerry Halliwell, former Spice Girl.
Oh, cool.
I did her book. I did her just after she left the Spice Girls and was being chased around the world by the paparazzi. And everyone wanted to know the reason, why did the band break up? What was the great split? And so I didn't want to do that book. I remember I had two young daughters who drove me nuts listening to Spice Girl music, and I thought, Jerry is 26 years old. What does she have to say? But it turned out to be a wonderful late 20th century fairy tale, really, of a girl who sang into a hairbrush dreaming of being Madonna, just as so many young people today dream of being Beyonce or Justin Timberlake. And she was the first to admit that when it came to singing, she wasn't the best singer or the best dancer, but she was desperate to be famous. And she became one of the most famous women on the planet, worth millions and millions of pounds, and had never been more miserable in her life. She was anorexic and bulimic and completely miserable. So it is that sort of morality tale of be careful what you wish for. Fame and money, it's not going to bring you happiness.
Did your daughters, being Spice Girls fans, get excited?
My 6-year-old was sworn to secrecy because, you imagine how famous she would have been in a school if she could have gone to school and said, my dad's working with a Spice Girl. I mean, so she was complete, and she did, bless her cotton socks, because there was an enormous amount of security involved in this, because, I had Fleet Street journalists going through rubbish bins and all sorts of things looking for any snippet of information, about this book. So, bless her, she didn't say a word until finally, when the book was all finished and about to come out, I told her that she could tell her friends. And so she went to school, and she told her friends, and Jerry had signed a T-shirt for her and all this other stuff, and it was great. And about a week later, I was sitting at home, and my daughter's name was Alex, and she was watching the Spice Girls movie with a little friend. And it reaches that point in the movie. There's a point in the movie where the Spice Girls are in Italy, and these hunky Italian backing singers wearing tight leather trousers are dancing behind them, and they spin around, and the buttocks are cut out of their trousers. And this little friend of Alex's nudged her and said, "Is one of them your dad?" Oh, your dad's working with the Spice. They thought that. Yeah, it was fun.
When you were starting out as a writer, did you have any people who inspired you or who drove you into wanting to work in the fields you worked in?
Yeah, no, I discovered I probably wanted to be a writer from the age of 12. And I was living in Bendigo, or it might have been just actually, I can't remember, we'd moved to Coffs Harbour by then, but I was 12 years old, and I discovered the works of Ray Bradbury, brilliant short story writer, and the man who wrote also Fahrenheit 451 and Something Wicked This Way Comes. And you could only get about 4 or 5 Bradbury titles in Australia at that point. And I very naively wrote a letter addressed to Ray Bradbury, Random House, New York. That was all I put on the envelope. And about 3 months passed, and a letter and a package arrived through the post. I came home from school, and there was a package, and it contained the 3 or 4 books that were available in Australia, along with a letter from Ray Bradbury himself, saying how thrilled he was to have a young fan on the far side of the world. Now, about 18 months ago, I wrote that story up for an American magazine, and it was published on my publisher's website in America. And I actually said that, Ray Bradbury once said that Jules Verne was his literary father, Mary Shelley was his literary mother, and Edgar Allan Poe was the bat-winged cousin they kept locked in the attic. And I said that Ray Bradbury was my literary father, and that Steinbeck and Hemingway were my overachieving older brothers. But a week after the story was published, I got an email from Alexandra Bradbury, who was Ray Bradbury's youngest daughter. Yep. I had no idea that Ray was still alive. She said, "My dad is 91 years old and completely blind, but I read in the story you wrote, and I wanted you to know that you made an old man cry, and he wanted you to know that you are his son."
That is such an amazing story.
It's so moving. And I suppose there are 2 postscripts to that. One is that I was due to tour America in that October, and I was going to plan to go to Los Angeles and to actually have lunch or dinner with Ray. But he died in July, and there was a massive outpouring of stories, and people like Steven Spielberg and Neil Gaiman, and even Joanne Harris, a whole lot of other writers told very similar stories to the one that I've just told you. That was just after Curiosity had landed on Mars, the Mars lander, and President Obama announced from the White House the landing spot, Curiosity, would forever be known as Bradbury's Landing, because one of his most famous short story books was The Martian Chronicles.
Yeah. From all accounts, I've heard that Ray Bradbury sounds like a very genuinely nice person.
Yep, he was a completely charming man, and so generous to young writers. I think he's one of the reasons, his generosity, that's one of the reasons I wanted to be a writer.
You actually have a similar story that you've told me earlier this weekend about Stephen King, if you want to share that to the listeners.
Oh, that was more a story, just I guess, of being bowled over. I mean, I think it was my 4th novel, was a novel called Shatter, and Stephen King, I don't know how he got hold of a copy or whether he's a voracious reader, but he has a regular column in Entertainment News, a magazine or a newspaper in America, and he wrote a story, and he called Shatter his #1 book of the summer, and said it was the most frightening book he'd read in a decade. And I remember being completely bowled over and saying to my wife, if I never sold another book, it wouldn't matter, because I could sit in my rocking chair in my old age and tell my grandchildren how Stephen King once said that I'd scared the pants off. So, no, enormously. That's one of the probably the nicest things that's ever happened to me as a writer.
You're at this stage now where you'll have quite a few fans. What's it like when you meet some of your more passionate fans?
Some of them are quite funny. I mean, I was in Harrogate at a crime writing festival in Yorkshire in England, and a woman fainted. She got to the end of it. She got to her place in the queue, and I sort of looked up, and she handed me the book, and I looked up and said, "Oh, do you want me to dedicate the book to you?" And her mouth opened up and down. She tried to say something, and she just couldn't get the words out, and then she fainted. Which was so. And then she came to, and she was so embarrassed, and she just kept trying to say, "Oh, I love your book so much," And it was no. I think it's yeah. That doesn't happen very often. It's not like there are a couple of times I've been touring in a place like Germany, which is one of my biggest markets, where you got a little inkling of what it must be like to be a rock star, because there are fans waiting at the hotel for you when you get there, and not hundreds, there'll be just a handful, but it's just that's nice.
I've heard a lot of stories of particularly musicians or whatever who back home, say back in Australia, they might be pretty anonymous, but a very specific part on the other side of the world, if it's Britain or Germany or a part of Europe, they go there and they are.
It sort of struck me a couple of times. I think once was in the Netherlands when I arrived at Schiphol Airport in Amsterdam, and I was taking a taxi into the hotel, and I looked up and there was a billboard that was sort of 20 foot high with my face on it. And I thought, I've got a face that only a mother could love, and I'm thinking, why on earth would they think that would sell books, And then suddenly you're going through town and your face is plastered over the tram stops and things like that, and it's very surreal. It is very surreal. And then similarly in Cologne, I once had about 750 people turn up to see an event, and they queued for over an hour in the snow to get their book signed. I remember thinking, I wouldn't wait for God that long. It's incredibly humbling and flattering. And it's not why we do it, but it's enormously flattering when it happens.
Is there a point that you can trace where you realise how popular you got?
A little thing. It works two ways. I mean, every time writing is a very humbling experience. Every time you think that you've cracked it, something will happen where you realise you haven't. For example, touring America is a classic example. It's either feast or famine. You'll turn up in some bookstore in Dallas or Houston, and there'll be 70 people, and they'll be waiting for you to talk, and there'll be 100 pre-ordered hardback books for you to sign, and you think, oh, this is it. I'm doing okay. And then next stop San Diego, and one person will show up. One person, and you're thinking, and you're embarrassed, and the bookshop is embarrassed, and your publishers are embarrassed, and you feel about 2 inches tall, and you realise that there's always going to be those mortifying moments. And I sort of served my time in the early days, even in Australia. I'd tour in Australia, and 3 people would show up, and one of them would be in a pram, but you'd persevere, and then I've been back to some of those same places and had 70 and 80 people turn up now, including those first few that showed up who brought all their friends.
Did you get nervous going back to those places?
I remember telling my publishers when I remember they booked me to go to a place called Kingston, south of Hobart, and I said, do you realise last time I went there, 3 people showed up? I said, are you really sure you want me to go there? Saying, no, they're fine. They're telling me that there's lots of people booked to come. And then I was bowled over when there were so many people there. And as I say, including the people that were there. And if you turn up at some event and there's only a handful of people, you just draw the chairs in a circle and you say, okay, this is a book club meeting now. Or in America, I've just said, okay, there's a bar over the road, I'm shouting, and because it's not going to cost very much, there's so few people turn up. So that's the nature of it. Some countries you feel like a rock star, and other countries you realise that you're a complete unknown.
I like how you did get creative with the poor turnout time.
Because you could just, with a small intimate gathering like that, you can just gather people around and say, well, what are you reading? And what's your favourite book? And just chat about books rather than, spruiking yourself with your own book.
Do you have any advice for newer writers that are trying to get themselves established or get themselves known or get themselves read?
I think you write and you write and you write and you write, and when you're completely sick of writing, you write some more. The only way to get better is to write. And the other thing I would say is that If you're writing to be rich and writing to be famous, forget it. And the average income of an author in Australia, full-time author, is less than $12,000. You write because it's a passionate hobby. You write just as it would be if you love playing the piano or you love painting. Make it a passionate hobby. Make it so passionate, if they outlawed it tomorrow, you would do it by candlelight in your basement while the jackboots marched in the streets above. You just write because you love writing. And then if you're good enough and you're lucky enough and the planets line up, you may be able to get published, you may be able to have a career out of it. I think that's the way to approach it. It's always been hard to get published, and now there are great new avenues for self-publishing, but that's not an excuse for just putting something poor quality book out there. I mean, if you can't get a publishing deal, try to write a better book and try that. I know so many authors that it was their 6th, 7th, 8th book that they got a publishing deal. You've got to put the work in.
You're right, it is much easier to self-publish nowadays, but at the same time that just dilutes the market.
Well, it does. It's created this sort of tsunami of self-published authors, which I think is enormously positive. I mean, the e-book phenomenon it's wonderful to think that anywhere you are in the world, as long as you have an internet connection, you can download a book in 30 seconds or 60 seconds. I mean, that's a huge benefit to reading and to writing. But the downside is, this tsunami of self-published books my fear is, how do you find the quality amongst that? And there are some true gems, some truly, truly great books. And my fear is that some truly great books may be lost in, this absolute sort of wave of self-published books. And maybe one day it'll get to the point where it's going to be easier to find a mainstream publisher than it is to be noticed as a self-published author, to get your book noticed.
That's very interesting. Although I suppose it does help having the avenue, as much as you're going to be lost in the sea, having the avenue to be able to, if you meet someone or get into a conversation with someone, you can say, okay, I've got a book just on this site. You can look it up in your own time. I don't have to mail it to you or anything like that.
And it's tremendous. I mean, because it's meant that all of these books also that are out of print, I mean, great books that are sent out of print can now be back and available again. I mean, no, it's enormous benefit. It's enormously beneficial. I hate it when people refer to it as vanity publishing, as though, but there's no doubt that some people are doing it as a vanity act. But for other people, it's a legitimate way of getting their book out there. And there are stories. There are stories of people who have broken through in a huge way, obviously, by self-publishing and being, discovered that way. My one issue with it, and again, I mean, this is obviously coming from someone I'm very fortunate to make a living at it, what I do, is piracy. And we've already seen, with the music industry, the effect of piracy and I know that, at one point there, I've just had a new novel out, and within 24 hours, there were probably 6 sites that popped up, BitTorrent sites offering the book. And that will one day, the more and more the digital world sort of takes up, and the more I think the generation of people that have grown up buying books are replaced by the generation of people who have grown up downloading what they like for nothing. The two are going to collide, and it's going to become very difficult for writers to make a living.
That's absolutely right, and the technology is outpacing the law and is outpacing so many other aspects of the industry.
Yeah.
To you, when you sit down to start your next book or start your next chapter, are you doing that because you have to do it because you're making a living, or do you still do it because you get to do it? Is it?
Well, it works two ways. It's funny, you write because you love writing. People, I used to get asked the question, what would you do if you wrote a book and it made you millions and millions of dollars and you never had to work again? And I'd say, well, I'd write another book. And I go, but why? You wouldn't have to. You'd never, and I think, well, no, I think I write because I love writing. That's the reason. And a lot of people can't get their heads around that. They just assume that if you didn't have to work, you wouldn't. It works two ways for me. I'm not tossing champagne bottles off the back of a yacht somewhere. I mean, I still have to pay a mortgage and put kids through school, and I can't just stop working. Or if I did, if my books didn't pay their way, I'd have to find, as most writers do, to find other work to supplement my income.
Yeah, I guess if you did have that book, that fortunate book that made you millions and millions of dollars, it'll just give you the freedom to pursue and not have to worry about finding that extra bit of work if you.
Yeah, I know. There's definitely. But it's really interesting. There's a story. I don't know whether this is an apocryphal story, but there's a story that I heard about Tom Keneally when Tom Keneally won the Booker Prize with Schindler's List. For the first time in his life, he suddenly, because that sold enormous numbers of copies, and he suddenly had money. And he thought, this is great, because now when, I get sick of a novel, as all writers do when they're sort of halfway through, when I get really sick of it, I can pop it in the bottom drawer and start something new, and I'll go back to it when I'm charged up. And years passed afterwards, and he realised that he wasn't finishing anything, and it was that compulsion of having to finish to get paid that next bit of the money that forced him to finish books. And I don't know with me whether, if I had a book that made me so much money, whether that would make me in a sense lazy or make me just never finish a novel. Whereas now I know I've got to deliver come December because that's the deadline, and then I get paid.
Thank you, Michael Robotham, for catching up with me and having a local chat with me.
It's a pleasure. You can always get me at www.michaelrobotham.com, and also on Facebook and Twitter.
I'll have a link to these just below. People listening on www.thenewlocal.net can just scroll down and click on these links. Thank you.
Thank you.